The morning sun cast long shadows across the Pentagon's corridors as Admiral Marcus Hawk Richardson strode through the familiar hallways. After 32 years in the Navy, with 24 of those spent in the SEALs, he knew these walls like the back of his weathered hands. The 3 stars on his uniform caught the light as he made his way to what he assumed would be another routine briefing about joint operations. At 61, Admiral Richardson had seen it all. He'd commanded SEAL teams in Afghanistan, Iraq, and countless classified operations that would never make it into history books. His reputation preceded him wherever he went. A no-nonsense leader who demanded excellence and had little patience for what he called Pentagon politics. His fellow officers respected him. Some feared him, but all knew that when Hawk Richardson spoke, you listened. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Richardson had reviewed the briefing materials over his black coffee and toast, noting that the session would cover new developments in special operations coordination between different military branches. The agenda mentioned a presentation by someone identified only as Commander S. Martinez, SOCOM. He'd skimmed past the name without much thought, probably another desk jockey with fancy theories about how special operations should work, he figured. The conference room was already half full when Richardson arrived. He nodded to familiar faces, other admirals, a few generals, and various colonels and captains who made up the special operations community's leadership. The morning light filtered through tall windows, illuminating a room that had witnessed countless strategic decisions over the decades. Richardson took his usual seat near the middle of the long mahogany table, placing his coffee cup precisely where he always did. As the meeting began, Richardson's attention drifted during the opening remarks. He'd heard similar speeches about inter-service cooperation dozens of times before. His mind wandered to his grandson's upcoming baseball game, which he'd promised to attend if his schedule allowed. At 15, young Tommy was showing real promise as a pitcher, and Richardson tried to make it to as many games as possible. The first few presentations were exactly what he'd expected. PowerPoint slides filled with acronyms, charts showing organizational structures, and the usual military jargon about synergistic approaches and enhanced operational capabilities. Richardson found himself checking his watch more than once, wondering when they'd get to something substantive. Then the briefing officer announced the next presenter. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Commander Sofia Martinez, who will be discussing the new SOCOM integration protocols. Richardson looked up from his notes as a woman entered the room. She appeared to be in her early 40s, carrying herself with the kind of confidence that came from real experience rather than just rank. Her uniform was immaculate. But what caught Richardson's attention wasn't her appearance. It was the way she moved. There was something about her bearing that suggested she'd seen actual combat, not just staff positions. As she began setting up her presentation, Richardson felt that familiar skepticism rising. In his experience, most of the people who talked about special operations these days had never actually been in them. They were analysts, staff officers, and policy experts who understood the theory but had never felt the weight of a combat pack or made split-second decisions with lives hanging in the balance. Commander Martinez began her presentation with a brief overview of current special operations challenges. Her voice was clear and authoritative, but Richardson was only half listening. He was already forming his opinion about what was likely to be another academic discussion about things he'd been living and breathing for decades. About 10 minutes into her presentation, Commander Martinez made a point about the importance of ground-level leadership in special operations. She emphasized how decisions made by commanders who had never been in the field often failed to account for the realities that operators faced. Richardson couldn't help himself. Despite the formal setting and the fact that he was surrounded by senior officers, his natural directness took over. He'd never been one to sit quietly when he disagreed with something, regardless of who was speaking. "Commander," he interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of his rank and experience. "With all due respect, that's easy to say from behind a desk. But have you ever actually been in the field with special operations units? Have you ever had to make those decisions when bullets are flying and your team's lives depend on it?" The room fell silent. This kind of direct challenge during a formal briefing was unusual, even for Richardson, who was known for his blunt speaking style. Several officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and Richardson could feel the tension in the air. Commander Martinez paused, her hand still on the presentation remote. She looked directly at Richardson, and for a moment, he saw something in her eyes that he hadn't expected. Not offense or embarrassment, but rather a kind of calm recognition, as if she'd been waiting for exactly this question. "That's a fair question, Admiral Richardson," she said, using his name despite the fact that they'd never been formally introduced. "I appreciate your directness." Richardson was slightly taken aback that she knew who he was. But he pressed on. "It's not about being fair, Commander. It's about credibility. In my experience, too many people who've never been downrange try to tell those of us who have how to do our jobs." The other officers in the room exchanged glances. Richardson's reputation for speaking his mind was well known, but this was more confrontational than usual. Some looked uncomfortable with the public challenge, while others seemed interested to see how the commander would respond. Commander Martinez nodded thoughtfully. "You're absolutely right that experience matters, Admiral. Field experience, real operational experience, is irreplaceable. No amount of theoretical knowledge can substitute for having been there, for having made those life and death decisions you're talking about." Richardson expected her to leave it at that, to acknowledge his point and move on. Most staff officers would have deflected or tried to change the subject. Instead, she continued, "You ask if I've been in the field with special operations units," she said, her tone remaining professional, but with an undertone that Richardson couldn't quite identify. "If I've made decisions when bullets are flying." She paused, and Richardson noticed that her posture had shifted slightly. There was something different about the way she was standing now. Something that reminded him of how operators carried themselves after they'd seen real action. "The answer to your question, Admiral, is yes. I have been in the field. I have made those decisions. And I've lost team members because of decisions I made, which is something that stays with you forever." The room was completely quiet now. Richardson found himself studying her more carefully, reassessing his initial impression. There was something in her voice when she mentioned losing team members that he recognized, the weight that came with command responsibility in combat. But Richardson wasn't ready to back down yet. He'd been in too many meetings where people claimed experience they didn't really have. "Which units, Commander? When and where?" It was a direct challenge, the kind of question that would expose someone who was exaggerating their background. Richardson had asked similar questions many times over the years, and had seen plenty of people stumble when pressed for specifics. Commander Martinez looked at him steadily. "I've served with multiple special operations units over the past 15 years, Admiral. Most recently in Syria and Afghanistan. Before that, Iraq and several classified operations I can't discuss in this setting." Richardson's skepticism remained, but something about her tone was giving him pause. She wasn't defensive or evasive, which was usually what happened when someone was caught inflating their experience. Instead, she sounded matter-of-fact, as if she was simply stating information, rather than trying to prove anything. "Special operations support?" Richardson asked, using the term that often described personnel who worked with spec ops units but weren't actually operators themselves. "Intelligence? Communications?" Commander Martinez shook her head. "No, Admiral. Command positions. Leading operations." Richardson felt a flicker of surprise, but his skepticism was deeply ingrained. In his experience, very few officers had the kind of extensive special operations command experience she was claiming, especially at her apparent age and rank. "Command of what kind of units, exactly?" The question hung in the air. Richardson was aware that he was pushing harder than was probably appropriate in this setting, but something about the situation had triggered his instinct to test people's claims. He'd spent too many years dealing with people who talked a good game but had never actually played. Commander Martinez seemed to consider her response carefully. Richardson got the impression that she was deciding how much to reveal rather than trying to figure out how to answer. "I've commanded various special operations elements, Admiral. Different types of units. Different missions. Some conventional special forces. Some less conventional." The phrase "less conventional" caught Richardson's attention. In the special operations community, That usually meant units that operated in the gray areas, the kind of groups that didn't appear on standard organizational charts. Richardson's curiosity was now genuinely piqued, though his skepticism remained. "Commander, I've been in special operations for over 2 decades. I know most of the major players, especially anyone who's commanded significant operations. I have to say, I don't recall hearing your name in those circles." It was a blunt statement, but Richardson believed it was true. The special operations community was relatively small, and word traveled fast about successful commanders. If someone had the kind of experience Commander Martinez was claiming, Richardson felt he should have heard of her. Commander Martinez smiled slightly, and Richardson caught something in that smile that made him pause. It wasn't arrogant or condescending, but there was a confidence there that suggested she knew something he didn't. "That might be because a lot of what I've done doesn't get discussed in the usual circles, Admiral," she said. "Some operations, some units, stay out of the normal reporting channels." Richardson understood immediately what she was implying. There were indeed special operations units that worked in complete secrecy, conducting missions that were never acknowledged, and whose personnel remained anonymous even within the military community. But claiming to have commanded such units was a serious assertion. The other officers in the room were following the exchange with obvious interest. This had gone far beyond a simple question about credentials and had become something approaching an interrogation. Richardson decided to push one more time. "Commander, I mean no disrespect, but you're making some significant claims about your background. In this business, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence." Commander Martinez nodded, as if she'd expected this response. "You're absolutely right, Admiral. They do." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a folder. Richardson watched as she opened it and removed a single sheet of paper. She glanced at it briefly, then looked back at him. "Admiral Richardson, before I answer your questions more specifically, I need to ask you something. What's your current security clearance level?" The question caught Richardson off guard. "I have SCI clearance, obviously. I've held various special access program clearances over the years." Commander Martinez nodded. "And you're currently read into which SAPs?" SAPs stood for Special Access Programs. The most classified military operations. The kind that were compartmentalized even from most senior officers. Richardson was surprised by the specificity of her question. "I'm read into several current programs," he answered carefully. "Why?" Commander Martinez looked down at the paper in her hand again. "Because, Admiral, if you really want to know about my background, about the units I've commanded, and the operations I've led, I'm going to need to know exactly which clearances you hold, because most of what I've done for the past 15 years is classified at levels that require very specific authorization to discuss." Richardson felt a shift in his understanding of the situation. This wasn't someone making vague claims about special operations experience. This was someone who was talking about classification levels and compartmentalized information with the kind of specificity that suggested real familiarity with how the most secret military operations actually worked. The room had grown even quieter, if that was possible. Several of the other officers were looking back and forth between Richardson and Commander Martinez, clearly sensing that something significant was happening but not entirely sure what. Richardson found himself in an unusual position. His challenge to Commander Martinez had been based on his assumption that she was overstating her experience, but her responses were suggesting that perhaps the opposite was true, that he might not have the appropriate clearances to know about her background. For the first time since the exchange began, Richardson felt genuinely uncertain about how to proceed. Admiral Richardson sat back in his chair, processing what had just happened. In 32 years of military service, he couldn't remember a time when someone had essentially told him he might not have sufficient clearance to know about their background. The suggestion was both humbling and intriguing. "Commander," he said, his tone noticeably less confrontational than before, "I think we may need to have a different kind of conversation." Commander Martinez glanced around the room at the other officers, then back at Richardson. "Perhaps we should, Admiral. But maybe not here. With this audience." Richardson understood immediately. If they were talking about highly classified operations, a general briefing room with dozens of officers wasn't the appropriate venue. He looked at his watch, then at the briefing officer who had been moderating the session. "Colonel Peters, I think the commander and I need to step out for a few minutes to clarify some background issues," Richardson announced. "Can we take a brief recess?" Colonel Peters, looking somewhat bewildered by the turn the session had taken, nodded quickly. "Of course, sir. We'll reconvene in 15 minutes. Richardson stood and gestured toward the door. "Commander Martinez, would you join me in the corridor?" As they left the briefing room, Richardson could hear the immediate buzz of conversation that erupted behind them. He led Commander Martinez down the hall to a smaller conference room that he knew would be empty at this time of day. Once inside with the door closed, Richardson faced her directly. "Commander, I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about your background that were clearly premature." Commander Martinez waved off the apology. "No need, Admiral. Your questions were reasonable, given the information available to you. In your position, I would have asked the same things." Richardson studied her more carefully now, looking for clues he might have missed earlier. "You mentioned you're with SOCOM. What's your actual position there?" Commander Martinez paused, and Richardson got the sense she was deciding how much she could reveal. "My official title is Deputy Director of Special Activities Division." Richardson felt his eyebrows rise. The Special Activities Division was one of the most secretive parts of SOCOM, responsible for operations that were never officially acknowledged. If she was the Deputy Director, that would explain both her security clearance concerns and why he hadn't heard of her through normal channels. "SAD reports directly to the Joint Chiefs," Richardson said, more as a statement than a question. Among others, Commander Martinez confirmed, "Our operations are compartmentalized even from most SOCOM leadership. The Special Activities Division handles what you might call the missions that don't officially exist." Richardson was beginning to understand why their conversation had taken such an unexpected turn. "And before SAD?" Commander Martinez looked at him thoughtfully. "Admiral, before I go further, I need to understand why this matters to you. Are you asking because you're curious? Or because this is relevant to something operational?" It was a fair question, and Richardson realized he wasn't entirely sure of his own motivations. "Honestly, Commander, I started this conversation because I thought you were another staff officer with more theories than experience. Now I'm realizing I may have been completely wrong about that." "You weren't completely wrong," Commander Martinez said with a slight smile. "I do have theories, but they're based on rather extensive experience." Richardson decided to be direct. "How extensive?" Commander Martinez was quiet for a long moment, apparently weighing her response. Finally, she seemed to reach a decision. "Admiral, I joined the military 18 years ago. I spent my first 3 years in conventional units, then was selected for special operations training. For the past 15 years, I've been in various special operations roles, culminating in my current position with SAD." "Which special operations units?" Richardson asked. "I started with the 75th Ranger Regiment," she said. "After that, Delta Force for 6 years. Then I moved into what we call non-traditional units." Richardson felt a genuine shock. Delta Force was one of the most elite units in the military, and they rarely took officers directly from the Rangers. "You were with Delta for 6 years?" "I was," Commander Martinez confirmed. "I commanded a squadron for the last 2 years of that assignment." Richardson was trying to process this information. Squadron command in Delta Force was typically reserved for the most experienced and capable officers. It wasn't a position given to someone who hadn't proven themselves repeatedly in combat. "After Delta," he asked. "That's where things get more complicated," Commander Martinez said. "I was recruited for a unit that doesn't have an official designation. We called it Task Force Gray. Our mission was to conduct operations that were too sensitive for any acknowledged unit to handle." Richardson had heard rumors about units like Task Force Gray, small, elite teams that operated completely outside normal military channels. But he'd never met anyone who admitted to being part of one. "What kind of operations?" he asked. Commander Martinez looked at him steadily. The kind that never happened, Admiral. Operations in countries where we weren't supposed to be, against targets that were never officially acknowledged, using methods that would be denied if they ever came to light. Richardson felt like he was getting a glimpse into a part of the military that he'd always suspected existed, but had never encountered directly. How long were you with Task Force Gray? Quote, 5 years, Commander Martinez replied. I commanded the task force for the last 2 years before moving to my current position with SAD. The timeline was starting to make sense to Richardson. If Commander Martinez had the background she was describing, her current position as Deputy Director of the Special Activities Division was a logical progression. Commander, Richardson said, I have to ask, why are you telling me this? This level of detail about classified units and operations isn't something you'd normally discuss. Commander Martinez nodded. You're right, it isn't. But there's something you need to know. Admiral, the reason I'm here today, the reason I'm giving this briefing, is because SAD has been tasked with developing new protocols for integrating conventional special operations with what we call enhanced activities. Richardson wasn't sure he liked the sound of that. Enhanced activities? Operations that require capabilities beyond what conventional special operations can provide, Commander Martinez explained. Situations where we need the kind of flexibility and deniability that only units like Task Force Gray can offer. Richardson was beginning to understand where this was heading. And you need cooperation from conventional special operations commanders. Exactly, Commander Martinez confirmed. Which is why your questions about my background are actually quite relevant. If we're going to work together effectively, you need to understand that the people you'll be dealing with from SAD aren't theoretical strategists. We're operators who've been doing this work for years. Richardson felt like the conversation had come full circle, but from a completely different direction than he'd expected. What kind of cooperation are we talking about? Commander Martinez glanced at her watch. We should probably get back to the briefing room. But Admiral, I'd like to continue this conversation afterward. What I'm about to present is going to raise questions that I think you'll want to discuss in more detail. As they walked back toward the briefing room, Richardson found his mind racing. The morning had started with what he thought would be a routine briefing, and now he was learning about military units and operations that he'd never imagined existed. More importantly, he was realizing that his assumptions about Commander Martinez had been not just wrong, but spectacularly wrong. When they re-entered the briefing room, the conversations among the other officers stopped immediately. Richardson could sense that everyone was curious about what had transpired during their private discussion, but no one was bold enough to ask directly. Commander Martinez returned to her position at the front of the room and resumed her presentation. But now, Richardson was listening with completely different ears. Every point she made about special operations integration took on new meaning when he understood the perspective she was bringing to it. As she spoke about the need for flexibility in command structures, Richardson realized she was talking from the experience of having commanded units that operated without any conventional oversight. When she discussed the importance of compartmentalized operations, he understood that she was describing methods she had personally used in the field. About 20 minutes into the resumed presentation, Commander Martinez began discussing something called parallel operations. Situations where conventional special operations units and SAD elements would work toward the same objectives without necessarily coordinating directly. The key to parallel operations, she explained, is ensuring that conventional units understand they may encounter activities in their operational area that are not part of their mission, but which are supporting the same overall objectives. Admiral Richardson found himself leaning forward. Commander, can you give us a hypothetical example of how this might work? Commander Martinez looked directly at him. Certainly, Admiral. Imagine a situation where conventional special operations are tasked with gathering intelligence on a terrorist network in a particular region. At the same time, SAD elements might be conducting direct action against specific high-value targets within that same network. Without coordinating? Asked General Morrison, one of the other senior officers in the room. Without direct coordination, Commander Martinez confirmed. The conventional unit would be informed that there might be unexplained activity in their area, but they wouldn't be told specifics. This protects both operations. The conventional unit maintains plausible deniability, and the SAD operation maintains its security. Richardson could see the logic, but it also raised serious concerns. What about deconfliction? How do you prevent the two operations from interfering with each other? That's an excellent question, Commander Martinez said, and it's one of the primary reasons we're developing these new protocols. We need systems that allow for general coordination without compromising operational security. General Morrison spoke up again. Commander, this sounds like it could create significant command and control issues. How do conventional commanders maintain accountability for their operational areas if they don't know what SAD is doing? Commander Martinez nodded. You're absolutely right, General. That's exactly the challenge we're facing. Traditional command structures assume that a commander knows about all significant activities in their area of responsibility. These protocols require us to modify that assumption. Richardson found himself thinking about the implications. Commander, what you're describing sounds like it could create situations where conventional commanders are held responsible for outcomes they couldn't control or even predict. That's a real concern, Admiral, Commander Martinez acknowledged. Which is why we're proposing a new category of operational oversight. Conventional commanders would be informed when SAD operations are active in their area, but they wouldn't be briefed on specifics. They would have clearly defined limitations on their responsibility during those periods. The discussion continued for another hour, with various officers raising questions about everything from legal implications to tactical coordination challenges. Throughout it all, Richardson found himself impressed by Commander Martinez's depth of knowledge and her ability to address complex scenarios with specific, practical solutions. As the briefing concluded, Richardson realized that his entire understanding of modern special operations had been expanded in ways he hadn't expected. The military he thought he knew so well apparently had layers and capabilities that he'd only glimpsed today. After the formal session ended and the other officers began filing out, Richardson approached Commander Martinez again. Commander, I have to admit, this has been one of the most enlightening briefings I've attended in years. Commander Martinez smiled. I'm glad it was helpful, Admiral, but I suspect you have more questions than we had time to address. I do, Richardson confirmed. Would you be available for a more detailed discussion? I have a feeling my command is going to be involved in these new protocols, and I want to understand exactly what that means. Commander Martinez reached into her briefcase and pulled out a card. My direct number is on there, Admiral. I'm usually available for secure discussions. Richardson looked at the card. It was simple, with just her name, title, and a phone number. No unit designation, no official seals. Exactly what he would expect from someone in her position. One more question, Commander, Richardson said as she packed up her materials. Earlier, when I was challenging your credentials, you mentioned losing team members due to decisions you made. That's something that stays with every commander who's been in combat. Is that something you're comfortable discussing? Commander Martinez paused in her packing and looked at him directly. Admiral, in 15 years of special operations, I've lost 7 team members under my command. Each one was the result of a decision I made, even if those decisions were the best options available at the time. It's something that shapes how I approach every operation. The honesty in her voice was unmistakable. Richardson recognized the weight that came with those losses. He'd carried similar burdens throughout his own career. I understand completely, Commander. Thank you for sharing that. As Commander Martinez left the briefing room, Admiral Richardson remained behind, staring out the window at the Pentagon's courtyard. The morning had begun with what he thought would be a routine briefing about bureaucratic procedures. Instead, he'd encountered someone whose experience and capabilities far exceeded his initial assumptions. More importantly, he'd learned that the military he'd served for over 3 decades had depths and complexities that he was still discovering. The conversation with Commander Martinez had opened his eyes to operational realities that changed his understanding of modern warfare and the units that conducted it. 3 weeks after their initial encounter, Admiral Richardson found himself in a situation he never could have anticipated. He was sitting in a secure conference room deep within the Pentagon, surrounded by individuals whose names he didn't know and whose units weren't listed in any official organizational chart. At the head of the table sat Commander Martinez, but the woman he was seeing now was noticeably different from the officer who had given the briefing 3 weeks earlier. Gone was the formal presentation demeanor. In its place was someone who carried herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions in environments where hesitation meant failure. She was dressed in what Richardson had learned to recognize as the unofficial uniform of SAD personnel. Civilian clothes that were practical but unremarkable. The kind of outfit that would allow someone to blend in anywhere from a corporate boardroom to a Middle Eastern marketplace. "Admiral," Commander Martinez said as he entered the room. "Thank you for coming. I know this is outside normal protocols. I really liken this. Thanks for watching. All to say in the 25. Admiral Commander Martinez said. I know this is outside normal protocols. Commander Martinez said. Richardson took the seat that had been indicated for him. Commander, after our conversation 3 weeks ago, I've become very interested in understanding exactly what SAD does and how it relates to conventional special operations. That's why you're here, she confirmed. But before we begin, I need to make sure you understand the classification level of what you're about to hear. Everything we discuss in this room today is compartmentalized at levels that require special authorization to access. Richardson nodded. He'd been through the additional security clearance process over the past 3 weeks, a procedure that had been more intensive than anything he'd experienced in his career. The investigation had gone back decades, interviewing people he'd forgotten he knew, and examining aspects of his life he'd assumed were of no interest to anyone. Commander Martinez gestured to the other people in the room. These are my colleagues from various SAD elements. You don't need to know their real names or their specific backgrounds, but I can tell you that collectively, they represent over 80 years of special operations experience in environments and situations that don't officially exist. Richardson studied the faces around the table. There were 6 people besides himself and Commander Martinez. 3 men and 3 women, all appearing to be between 30 and 50 years old. What struck him was how normal they looked. These weren't the stereotypical special operations personnel he was used to working with. They looked like people you might encounter in any professional environment. Which, he realized, was probably exactly the point. Admiral, one of the men said, before we get into specifics, we want to make sure you understand why we've asked you here. Your reaction to Commander Martinez's briefing 3 weeks ago was noted by several people in the chain of command. Richardson wasn't sure how to interpret that. My reaction? Your willingness to challenge her credentials, then your ability to recognize when your assumptions were wrong, the man continued. That combination of skepticism and adaptability is exactly what we need in conventional special operations commanders who work with SAD. Commander Martinez leaned forward. Admiral, we're going to read you into an ongoing operation. Not because we need your direct involvement, but because we need you to understand how SAD operations intersect with conventional special operations in the real world. She activated a screen at one end of the room, displaying a map that Richardson recognized as showing parts of Eastern Europe. 6 months ago, we identified a network that was facilitating the movement of advanced weapons technology from former Soviet states to terrorist organizations in the Middle East. Richardson studied the map, noting the various marked locations. Conventional intelligence couldn't handle this? One of the women in the room responded. Conventional intelligence identified the network, but the people involved are operating in regions where official U.S. military presence would create diplomatic complications. Moreover, some of the individuals involved are officially allied with governments that are nominally friendly to the United States. Commander Martinez continued the briefing. The operation required multiple approaches. SAD elements infiltrated the network at various levels, while conventional special operations conducted surveillance and intelligence gathering in areas where our presence could be officially acknowledged. Parallel operations, Richardson said, remembering the concept from the briefing. Exactly, Commander Martinez confirmed. But this operation illustrates both the benefits and the challenges of that approach. The screen changed to show a timeline with various events marked. Richardson could see conventional special operations activities marked in blue, while SAD activities were marked in red. The 2 types of operations were clearly coordinated at a strategic level, but there were several points where they had come close to intersecting in ways that could have been problematic. 3 months into the operation, one of the men explained, a conventional special operations team conducting surveillance in Romania nearly encountered a SAD element that was extracting a network member for interrogation. Richardson could immediately see the problem. If the conventional team had intervened, thinking they were witnessing a kidnapping, it would have compromised both operations, Commander Martinez confirmed. The conventional team would have been acting according to their understanding of the situation, but they would have destroyed months of infiltration work. How did you prevent that? Richardson asked. Commander Martinez smiled, but it wasn't a particularly pleasant expression. We didn't, initially. The conventional team did intervene. They thought they were preventing a crime. Richardson felt a chill. What happened? The SAD element had to improvise, she explained. They convinced the conventional team that they were Romanian intelligence officers conducting an authorized operation. The conventional team commander made the decision to withdraw and report the incident through his chain of command. And then? Then we had to rapidly construct an entire fake operation to support the cover story, one of the women said. We had to brief Romanian intelligence on what had supposedly happened, get them to confirm the story if anyone asked, and modify our actual operation to account for the exposure. Richardson was beginning to understand the complexity involved. Did the operation succeed? Eventually, Commander Martinez said. But it took an additional 4 months and required resources we hadn't planned to use. More importantly, it demonstrated that our current coordination protocols are inadequate. The screen changed again, this time showing what appeared to be an organizational chart, but unlike any Richardson had seen before. Instead of the normal hierarchical structure, this showed overlapping circles with various connection points. Admiral, Commander Martinez said, this is what we're proposing for future operations. Instead of parallel operations that risk intersection, we want to create integrated operations with compartmentalized knowledge. Richardson studied the diagram. Meaning what, exactly? One of the men responded. Meaning that conventional special operations commanders would know when SAD operations are active in their area, and they would know how to coordinate if necessary, but they wouldn't know operational details. And SAD elements would have direct communication channels with conventional commanders. Commander Martinez added, but only for specific, predetermined circumstances. Richardson could see the logic, but he also saw significant practical challenges. What about accountability? Chain of command? Legal authorization? Those are exactly the issues we need conventional commanders to help us resolve, Commander Martinez said. You understand the operational requirements from the conventional side. We understand them from the SAD side. But we need to create systems that work for both. Over the next 2 hours, Richardson was walked through several more case studies. Each one illustrated different aspects of how SAD operations intersected with conventional military activities. Some were successful collaborations, others were near disasters that had been salvaged only through quick thinking and improvisation. What struck Richardson throughout the discussion was the level of operational complexity that SAD dealt with routinely. These weren't just military operations. They were intricate scenarios that involved diplomatic considerations, intelligence requirements, legal implications, and tactical challenges that went far beyond anything in his experience. Commander, Richardson said during a brief break, I have to ask, how do your people handle this psychologically? The level of complexity, the constant ambiguity, the fact that you're operating without normal support structures? Commander Martinez looked at him thoughtfully. That's an excellent question, Admiral. And it's one of the reasons we lose people. Lose people? Not in combat necessarily, she explained, though that happens too. But we lose people who simply can't handle the psychological pressure, operating without official acknowledgement, making decisions with incomplete information, carrying the weight of operations that can never be discussed or recognized. It takes a particular type of person to do this long term. One of the other SAD personnel spoke up. Most people in special operations have the support of their unit, their chain of command, official recognition of their service. We operate, knowing that if something goes wrong, the operation never happened, and we were never there. Richardson was beginning to understand why Commander Martinez had mentioned losing team members during their first conversation. How do you maintain unit cohesion under those circumstances? Very carefully, Commander Martinez replied. And with constant attention to the psychological well-being of our people. We have support systems, but they're necessarily limited and compartmentalized. As the briefing continued, Richardson found himself developing a deep respect for the men and women around the table. They were operating in an environment that would challenge even the most experienced conventional special operations personnel, and they were doing it without the normal support structures that military personnel relied on. Admiral, Commander Martinez said as the formal briefing concluded, we've shown you all this because we believe you can help us bridge the gap between conventional special operations and SAD activities. But we need to know if you're interested in that role. Richardson looked around the table at faces that had revealed nothing about their personal backgrounds, but had demonstrated extraordinary professional capabilities. What exactly are you asking me to do? We want you to serve as a liaison, Commander Martinez explained. You would maintain your current position and responsibilities, but you would also serve as a point of contact between SAD and conventional special operations. When we have operations that might intersect with conventional activities, you would help coordinate the interface. And when conventional commanders have questions about unusual activities in their operational areas, you would be able to provide appropriate guidance without compromising operational security, one of the men added. Richardson considered the proposal carefully. It was unlike anything he'd ever been asked to do, but it also represented an opportunity to contribute to military operations at a level he'd never imagined possible. What would this mean for my current responsibilities? He asked. Nothing changes with your current command, Commander Martinez assured him. This would be an additional duty, but one that would typically require only a few hours per month. Most of the coordination would be handled through secure communications, and when there are active operations, you would be briefed on what conventional commanders in affected areas need to know, she explained. Nothing more, nothing less. Your job would be to ensure that conventional operations don't inadvertently interfere with SAD activities, and that SAD operations don't create problems for conventional commanders. Richardson thought about his initial encounter with Commander Martinez 3 weeks earlier. His skepticism about her credentials had been based on assumptions that proved to be completely wrong. Now he was being offered a role that would give him insight into military capabilities he'd never known existed. Commander, he said finally, 3 weeks ago, I thought I understood how special operations worked in the modern military. Today, I'm realizing that what I knew was probably less than half the picture. That's true for most conventional commanders, Admiral, she replied, and it's not a criticism of you or them, it's simply the nature of compartmentalized operations. Richardson looked around the table one more time. These people represented a level of operational experience and capability that impressed him more than anything he'd encountered in his long career. More importantly, they had trusted him with knowledge that could compromise operations and endanger lives if mishandled. I'm interested, he said finally, but I need to understand the full scope of what I'm agreeing to. Commander Martinez nodded. We'll provide you with a complete briefing on your role and responsibilities. You'll also be assigned a secure communication system and given contact protocols for various scenarios. When would this start? Immediately, she said. We have 3 operations currently active that could potentially intersect with conventional special operations activities. Your first task would be to review those operations and identify potential coordination requirements. Over the following hour, Richardson was briefed on the administrative aspects of his new role. He learned about secure communication protocols, reporting requirements, and the legal framework that governed SAD operations. It was more complex than anything he'd dealt with in conventional military assignments, but it was also fascinating in its sophistication. As the meeting concluded, Commander Martinez walked him to the secure exit. Admiral, I want to thank you for your openness to this role. Most conventional commanders would have difficulty accepting that there are military activities they don't know about. Richardson paused at the security checkpoint. Commander, can I ask you something personal? Of course. When we first met 3 weeks ago, and I was challenging your credentials, You could have simply told me who you really were. Why didn't you? Commander Martinez smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, it was a completely genuine, unguarded expression. Because, Admiral, anyone can claim to have impressive credentials. What impressed me about you was that you continued to ask hard questions even when it became clear that you might be wrong. That kind of intellectual honesty is exactly what we need in people who work with SAD. Richardson considered this, and if I had backed down when you started talking about security clearances, then we would have found someone else for this liaison role, she said simply. We need people who ask the right questions, even when, especially when, those questions are uncomfortable. As Richardson left the Pentagon that evening, he reflected on how dramatically his understanding of military operations had changed in just 3 weeks. The challenge he'd made to Commander Martinez's credentials had started as simple skepticism about an unfamiliar briefer. It had evolved into an education about military capabilities and operations that existed in the shadows of the conventional forces he'd spent his career with. 2 months later, Admiral Richardson was sitting in his regular office, reviewing intelligence reports from his conventional command, when his secure phone rang with a tone he'd learned to recognize. It was Commander Martinez. Admiral, we have a situation developing in Central Asia that's going to require coordination with conventional forces. Can you be available for a secure briefing this afternoon? Richardson checked his schedule. I can clear 2 hours, starting at 1,400. What's the nature of the situation? A SAD operation has identified an immediate threat that requires rapid response capabilities beyond what we can provide. We need conventional special operations support, but the political situation requires that any official U.S. military involvement be completely deniable. Richardson understood immediately. This was exactly the kind of scenario his liaison role was designed to handle. I'll be there at 1,400. Anything I need to prepare? Just bring your understanding of rapid deployment capabilities for small special operations units, Commander Martinez replied. We'll brief you on everything else. As Richardson hung up the phone, he realized that his role as liaison had become more than just an additional duty. It had given him insight into a dimension of military operations that few people ever saw, and it had connected him to colleagues whose capabilities and dedication impressed him more each time he worked with them. The skeptical SEAL admiral who had questioned Commander Martinez's credentials 3 months earlier had evolved into someone who understood that the military he'd served for over 3 decades had depths and complexities that continued to surprise him. More importantly, he had learned that sometimes the most valuable education comes from having your assumptions challenged by people who know more than you initially realize. That afternoon's briefing would involve planning for an operation that would never officially happen, conducted by people whose identities would never be acknowledged, in support of objectives that would never be publicly discussed. For Admiral Richardson, it had become the most meaningful work of his career. Not despite its secrecy, but because of the extraordinary capabilities and dedication of the people who conducted operations in the shadows. When he looked back on that morning 3 months earlier, when he had lightheartedly questioned Commander Martinez's credentials, Admiral Richardson could only shake his head at his own assumptions. He had learned that in the world of modern special operations, the most impressive credentials often belong to people you'd never heard of, conducting missions that officially never happened. And sometimes, the most important lesson was learning when to stop asking questions and start listening to the answers.